that lecture? Oh, I've got mine.
I want to start his
I was
presentation
about
for him.
starting.
I think that's the second page. Whenever you're ready, I'll help you.
Good evening. Good evening. Can you all hear me? No? Is that improved? Can you hear me now? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Explorers Club. That's perfect. Thank you very much indeed. To introduce myself, my name is Fania Rose, and I am the first woman president of the Explorers Club. So I am known as President Emerita. I must first mention to you, thank you, thank you. Usually, when I stand up to speak, people say to me, Fania, be brief, be loud, and be seated. And that's exactly what I plan to do this evening. But besides welcoming you all here this evening, and just as a matter of interest, whoops, I have competition. How many of you have been in the Explorers Club in this room before? Oh, a good many. Welcome. And to the people who haven't been here before, welcome to the Explorers Club, because we are a club of storytellers. And you will find that this evening is no exception. And I have a huge privilege to welcome Dr. Joel Myers, founder and executive chair of AccuWeather, and if I may mention, is considered the father of modern commercial meteorology and the nation's most respected authority on the business of weather this evening. Welcome. AccuWeather tracks the record of proven superior accuracy that has saved over 12,000 lives and prevented injury to over 100,000 people. And that, you will have to admit, is very impressive. In addition, AccuWeather for Business serves more than half of the Fortune 500 and thousands of other businesses, and has saved companies close to 100 billion for helping them to minimize losses and better plan for the impact of severe and changing weather. Dr. Myers has been recognized as an amazing entrepreneur, and he has received many major awards from the American Meteorological Society and National Weather Association. In addition, he has served for 39 years on the board of Penn State, where he was awarded the university's highest honors. I'm not quite sure, after reading all about Dr. Myers, how he's managed to spare the time to write the book, The Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History. I'm sure we are all going to enjoy your presentation enormously. And so, without further ado, I welcome you, Dr. Joe Myers, to the Explorers.
Welcome, and it's great to see such a nice crowd here tonight. I'll try and do differently than a speech I heard about in Chicago recently. Apparently, the speaker droned on for 45 minutes and never looked up from his notes. And while he was droning on, people tiptoed out of the room. And when he finally did look up, there was only one person left. And he said to that person, "You must be quite a gentleman." And he said, "I am not. I'm the next speaker." So again, welcome and thanks for attending tonight. Now, we all recognize the impact that the weather conditions have on humanity and on many of us every day in many different ways. Much of our planning and activities are influenced by weather conditions, including travel, outdoor activities and events, what we wear, our mood, what we buy, and when we buy it, our health, the cost of food, our exposure to risk and harm, and even business and the economy. They're all influenced and even dependent on weather conditions and the weather forecast as well. Today, we'll be looking at weather events that had impacts well beyond those that affect us on a routine basis, but rather we'll be discussing major events and climatic events that truly changed the course of history and humanity. Without these dramatic events, the world would be a very different place, as it's entirely possible that Spain would have remained the dominant world power into the 20th century. The United States would have lost the war for independence from England, and Germany may have won World War II. Even before recorded history, there were weather events that impacted the future and made the Earth a very different place than it would be otherwise. Therefore, I'll begin my story this evening with the most important event, the one that led to the very emergence of the human race, the comet or asteroid strike that dramatically changed the Earth's weather and climate, thereby causing the demise of the dinosaurs and leading to the emergence of mammals and eventually humankind. Each species that emerged and thrived in the past or current time is uniquely crafted through evolution to live and survive in a limited range of environmental conditions. According to current theories, there have been 5 or 6 times over the past 500 million years in which more than half and perhaps as many as 90% of existing species on Earth disappeared completely due to predominantly changes in our climate, which left most species at that time unable to cope with the new climate that emerged. By far the best known of these events is the demise of the dinosaurs some 66 million years ago, when a comet or asteroid struck the Earth with more than 1 billion times as much energy as the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, smashing into the Gulf of Mexico near the Yucatan Peninsula, causing mile-high waves on the oceans and tsunamis, and sending massive amounts of debris into the atmosphere. The area struck was rich with hydrocarbons, and the impact set them aflame. As the hydrocarbons burned, they sent a substantial amount of soot into the atmosphere, which drastically cut the amount of sunshine reaching the surface, thereby causing the Earth's average temperature to drop by nearly 50 degrees, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, for a period of 30 years. This dramatic cooling, combined with the reduction of sunlight, which reduced the ability of plants and plankton to carry out photosynthesis, is believed to have caused the extinction of about 3/4 of all the plant and animal species then on the Earth, including nearly all of the dinosaurs. If not for that event, I might be a dinosaur here telling this story to an audience of dinosaurs. Yet, the devastation caused by that extinction also provided opportunities. In the millions of years that followed, mammals became dominant and eventually evolved into apes and ultimately into human beings. But the changes and advancements were far from linear. In fact, it was only about 72,000 years ago, a small time in the history of the Earth for sure, that humans barely survived the effects of a major volcanic eruption. Around 70,000 BC, the Toba volcano on Sumatra, Indonesia, erupted violently, ejecting 670 cubic miles of vaporized rock into the air. It's by far the largest volcanic eruption of which we have knowledge, with more than 30 times as much vaporized rock ejected into the atmosphere as in the 1815 Tambora eruption that led to the year without a summer. I'll have more on that later. And 1,000 times as much as the 1980 Mount Helena eruption. With great quantities of ash, dust, and debris in the air, it's believed that Toba dimmed the sun for at least 6 years, disrupted seasonal rains, choked off streams, and scattered cubic miles of hot ash across the Earth's surface. The evidence suggests that the average temperature of the Earth dropped 20 degrees Fahrenheit in some places. And that's a huge change, huge. A study by the American Journal of Human Genetics suggests these climate changes shrunk the number of early humans to as low as 2,000 people before the population began to rise again in the early Stone Age. The total world population of humans dropped so sharply, we were down to roughly 1,000 reproductive adults. And one study suggests there might have been as few as 40 reproductive adults remaining alive. So we humans almost vanished. So nobody would be telling this story. It's been estimated that 21% of all humans ever born have died in wars or conflict, humans killing humans. But it's only been the last 80 years that humans have had the ability to kill a large segment of the entire human population in one fell swoop. Might the next near extinction of humans and life on Earth result from man's warlike tendencies? Testosterone was needed by humans to survive against their natural enemies, tigers, lions, and warriors in the past. But now, that testosterone may be the enemy of our survival. In 530 AD, Halley's Comet passed close to the Earth and the Sun, and it's been theorized that this released a dust veil into the Earth's atmosphere, and possibly also between the Earth and the Sun, that lasted for several years and reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface substantially. A major eruption of the volcano Krakatoa in 535 AD, just 5 years later when that dust cloud began, further reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth. Now, whatever the cause, the years 535 and 536 had the most severe and protracted Northern Hemisphere cooling episodes of the past 2,000 years, with average temperatures dropping as much as 10 degrees Fahrenheit, causing crop failures and famines worldwide. And also, when the temperature drops that much, was subject to various pandemics, or worse. At the same time that this all was happening, severe drought in northern and eastern Africa killed crops, which unleashed a chain reaction into the ecosystem. Gerbils and mice that normally fed on the crops died out, and the larger predators that normally would eat the rodents also died. When the drought ended a few years later, increased rainfall brought plant life back, and the fast-breeding gerbils were able to rapidly repopulate their numbers. Because the larger predators took longer to spring back, the rodents were able to multiply far beyond their previous numbers. And so, for a few years, East Africa was overrun by mice and gerbils, which were carriers of the bubonic plague, but immune to it themselves. The rodents came to Europe on merchant ships and rapidly spread the plague throughout Europe. In 541, the peak, it laid waste to cities and leaving so many corpses piled up that there were not enough people left to bury them. The bubonic plague swept through Constantinople, killing nearly 10,000 people a day, ravishing the Roman Empire, killing half of its inhabitants, thereby changing the balance of power throughout the world. It's been estimated that 25 to 50 million people died in that plague, which was 1/8 to 1/4 of the Earth's entire population at the time. That would be equivalent to 1 to 2 billion people today. That event had major impacts on history, as it weakened the Roman Empire sufficiently for the Arabs to defeat them in war, and that created conditions for the success of Muhammad in founding Islam in the early 7th century, and facilitated also the Anglo-Saxon conquest and unification of Britain. Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, united China to form the Yuan dynasty under his rule. He then decided to conquer the islands of Japan. After his demands for immediate surrender went unanswered, Kublai attacked Japan in October 1274 with 40,000 men and 900 ships. The Japanese defender, with a much lesser force of just 10,000 men compared to 40,000, and the Chinese attacker also had better weapons and a more suitable fighting style. All signs pointed to a rout of the Japanese defenders, but just as the Chinese forces were about to land in Japan, a powerful typhoon struck the coast and destroyed the attackers' fleet and most of their army. Now, if the Chinese had a greater knowledge of tropical storms and their propensity to occur in autumn, and had accordingly picked a different time of year for their invasion, the results would likely have been very different. Shinto priests who believed the storms were the result of prayer called them kamikaze, or divine wind. 7 years later, Kublai Khan brought together an even larger force, 140,000 soldiers, 4,400 vessels, to take the island once and for all. But again, nature intervened, with a furious hurricane wrecking 95% of the Chinese ships and leaving the survivors little match for the Japanese. From Spain's exploration of the Americas in the late 15th century until the late 16th century, the powerful Spanish Armada gave them dominance of the seas, control over the world's commerce, and leadership in the exploration and subjugation of the New World, beginning with Columbus's voyages. In 1588, King Philip of Spain sent the Armada to collect his army from the Netherlands, where they were fighting, and take them to invade England. After about 2 weeks of battle, the Spanish fleet was badly damaged and began to make a retreat. As the Armada reached the latitude of Ireland, it encountered what was then called a major hurricane. Hammered by the winds and sea, at least 24 major Spanish ships were driven ashore on the Irish coast, where many of the survivors were killed by Queen Elizabeth's English troops. The defeat of the Spanish Armada has been called one of the most decisive battles in Western civilization. Not only was Spain's military weakness demonstrated, but the battle depleted Spain's treasury to the point where it could no longer compete, allowing the British to fill the gap and become the world's dominant power. Debt from war is a killer of empires. Remember that. You may have heard of the Little Ice Age between 1300 and 1850, with reports of frozen rivers and exceptionally cold temperatures across Europe. But you probably have not considered that the colder temperatures during that period caused the wood in trees to grow differently than before or afterwards. At the peak of the Little Ice Age, Antonio Stradivorus used that wood to craft violins, which remain unique among usable instruments today. One recently sold for $45 million. The Little Ice Age may have been responsible for the Salem witch trials. When cold temperatures led to crop failures and economic hardship in New England, the people needed someone to blame, and witches fit the bill. Starting in Europe, witches were thought capable of controlling the weather, and the Salem witch trials fell within an extremely cold spell that lasted from 1680 to 1730. Some diaries and sermons dating from that period cite weather as the main cause for the prosecutions, which reached their peak in 1692. From 1730 on, the climate became warmer and more stable, and so did the general mood of the New England settlers. In 1709, Swedish King Charles XII led his armies to attack Russia during the winter, leading to a long march of exhaustion and death. Up until this point, Russia was considered a backward, inferior nation, but their defeat of Sweden had a great psychological impact, causing the Russian Tsar Peter I to be forever known as Peter the Great, and also greatly elevating the status of Russia. Of course, the real lesson here was not to attack Russia in winter, a lesson not learned by either Napoleon nor Hitler, as I will soon discuss. George Washington and most of the American troops were in what is now Brooklyn, not far from here, in the summer of 1776. In late August, the British landed a much larger number of troops in that area in preparation for an attack. On August 27th, the British charged the Americans with a superior force. With the British only a few hundred feet away, the American troops used the cover of dense fog to escape unnoticed across the East River, with Washington himself among the last to retreat. If not for that fog, historians believe General Washington would have been captured and the war likely ended with an American defeat. Very interesting, under a similar pattern today, the fog would likely not be as dense, nor perhaps even in existence, due to the urban heat island effect. In early 1777, Washington again faced potential disaster, as his troops were bogged down in New Jersey, surrounded by a superior British force, with muddy ground making movement near impossible. But as nighttime rain was followed by a strong northwest wind and temperatures holding steady during the day, and then even starting to fall in the afternoon, Washington realized this meant that a strong cold front had passed and the coming night would get much colder. Washington ordered his troops to prepare huge bonfires and make it appear that they were holding their ground for the night. But in the darkness, Washington had his troops evacuate as soon as the ground froze, moving his troops, cannons, and other materials northward to higher ground, where they were able to defeat the British the next day. Washington was, among other things, a farmer, and since agriculture was and is extremely dependent on weather conditions, he understood that better than most people. Washington's use of his weather knowledge saved his troops, in contrast with the Chinese and the Spanish defeats I discussed earlier, where the potential for crucial weather was ignored. The value of the weather forecast. If Washington had not used his knowledge of weather patterns to realize the ground would freeze as the basis for a strategic retreat, his forces would have instead been surrounded and captured, and America would have lost the war in 1777. 6 years later, in 1783, the Little Ice Age combined with an Icelandic volcano erupted and a major El Nino event to make crop yields plummet across much of Europe. France was already burdened by the cost of the aid they provided to the Americans in the Revolutionary War, so they had that burden of debt, a cycle of drought, and then fierce hailstorms and flooding in France between 1787 and 1788 destroyed most of the nation's crops, causing food prices to skyrocket. Although the crop of wheat used for bread was largely destroyed, there's no evidence that Marie Antoinette actually said the infamous "let them eat cake." That phrase was actually said by the wife of Louis XIV some 100 years earlier, and it was first attributed to Marie Antoinette in a book published in 1843. In any case, by 1789, the French economy was in turmoil, and the French Revolution soon followed. Again, government debt, run up from wars, led to the collapse of a nation, in this case, France. We Americans need to keep that in mind. Still in 1812, Napoleon was able to assemble the largest army Europe had ever seen, more than 600,000 strong. He was considered the greatest general in history. He must have been very charismatic as well to accomplish that. His men quickly captured Moscow and plundered its jewels and furs. But as his men left with their spoils, temperatures fell to minus 40 degrees, and the soldiers fell to frostbite and starvation. In one 24-hour period, 50,000 horses died from the cold. And of the 600,000 Frenchmen who marched into Russia, only one quarter, 150,000, would return. With Napoleon defeated, England was able to focus its attention on their war with the United States, which started in and is known as the War of 1812. They decided to strike for a psychological advantage, sending their troops to Washington, D.C. to burn it to the ground. The British did burn the White House and many other government buildings, and although the British policy was to leave private property alone, the conflagration of many public buildings threatened to spread out of control and put the entire city in jeopardy. But a massive summer storm hit Washington with heavy rains putting out most of the fires, and then multiple tornadoes collapsing many buildings and killing many British soldiers who had taken shelter in them. The storms battered and demoralized the British, causing them to end the occupation of Washington and ultimately to lose the war. Weather was obviously on the side of the Americans. The Mount Tambora volcanic eruption that occurred April 5th to the 15th over a 10-day period in 1815 was the world's largest since 150 AD, and along with several other volcanic eruptions in subsequent years, led to the so-called year without a summer, the unusual cold and snow that occurred from May to August of 1816, whose effects include crop failures, famine, epidemics, riots, arson, and looting in parts of Europe, Asia, and the United States, which impacted the economy and changed the development patterns of our young nation. Among the weather reported in July of 1816, lake and river ice in northwestern Pennsylvania, snow seen on Long Island, and several killing frosts across most of New England. The year without a summer also had some interesting cultural side effects. The price of oats in the United States rose from 12 cents per bushel in 1815 to 92 cents in 1816. The lack of oats to feed horses in Europe likely inspired the German inventor Karl Dries to research new ways of horseless transportation, which led to the invention of the precursor of the bicycle. Also, many Americans left New England for the Midwest, accelerating the westward movement of the American people. The family of Joseph Smith moved to Palmyra, New York from New England, which made possible the publication of the Book of Mormon and the founding of the Mormon Church. And in June of 1816, Mary Shelley was forced by the cold weather to spend her Swiss holiday indoors with her literary companions, where she and they had a contest to see who could write the scariest story. The result was the novel Frankenstein. The October 1871 Great Chicago Fire, which was allegedly started when Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocked over a lantern, may have actually been started by a meteor shower, as similar fires occurred elsewhere in the Midwest, and a particularly big one that killed many more people 200 miles away in Postigo, Wisconsin, on the same night, and actually claimed 5 times the number of lives as did the Chicago fire. Both occurred about the same time that a large meteoroid was observed entering the Earth's atmosphere. And Peoria, Illinois, and several other cities in the Midwest also reported major fires during that same period. Whatever the cause, all these fires were hot and fast-moving, raging out of control within minutes due to abnormally dry weather that had occurred the previous few months. I would venture that most of you have heard of the 1900 Galveston hurricane, which killed about 10,000 people, the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. Until that hurricane, Galveston was the 3rd largest city in Texas, only slightly behind San Antonio and Dallas. When Galveston was destroyed in 1900, Houston's growth accelerated. And then, thanks to the invention of air conditioning, which in a way is a weather control device, Houston is now the 4th largest city in the United States. Its location 50 miles further from the Gulf, though with a major bay providing unfettered access, made it a safer alternative and an ideal location, at least until Hurricane Harvey in 2017. You have probably never heard the name Samuel P. Langley. Yet if not for a gust of wind that sent his airplane platform lurching as it was about to take off, he would be renowned as the first to fly in a heavier-than-air craft. Instead, 9 days later, Wilbur and Orville Wright still had the opportunity to be first and succeeded with their airplane at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The 1930s were one of the hottest and driest decades in U.S. history, and that combined with the period's agricultural practices led to what is known as the Dust Bowl. Many of the record high temperatures from the heat waves of the 1930s still stand today. The all-time record highs in 23 states and the District of Columbia occurred in the mid-1930s. More than 3.5 million people were displaced by the Dust Bowl of the 30s, including the largest migration to California since the 1849 gold rush. That's equivalent to 10 million people at today's population. The federal government played an active role in trying to combat the negative effects of the drought and the Great Depression, which was exacerbated by the Dust Bowl. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt enacted the first of several mortgage and farming relief acts under the New Deal aimed to reduce foreclosures and keep farms afloat during the drought and depression. Agencies established included several that focused on land management and conservation. The weather conditions that fostered the Dust Bowl also led to a substantial expansion of government welfare programs such as Social Security and the increased role of the federal government that in turn helped the Democratic Party dominate the political agenda from the 1930s until 1952. And the Dust Bowl was also reflected in popular culture, such as the novel The Grapes of Wrath and folk songs of Woody Guthrie. Back in the 1920s and 30s, dirigibles looked like they might be the air transportation of the future. But the era of these ships ended abruptly on May 6, 1937, when the Hindenburg burst into flames during a landing at Lakehurst, New Jersey. Some thought it was pre-World War II sabotage. Others thought it was hit by lightning. But the cause was actually the craft's skin, which was made of iron oxide, covered with cellulose acetate, and stiffened with powdered aluminum. This mixture was similar to rocket fuel and highly combustible. When the Hindenburg passed through a rain cloud, it became negatively charged. When the crew dropped the wet lines to dock, the line acted as a ground. When the metal frame of the ship earthed its charge, the skin heated up and the highly flammable coating ignited. During the early stages of World War II, when Axis forces were winning battle after battle, the main Allied force was trapped near Dunkirk, a town along the English Channel in northern France. A retreat or rescue was nearly impossible, since the superior German Air Force would have blown any ships out of the water. But Winston Churchill called what he called a miracle of deliverance appeared, as heavy rains kept the German planes grounded, while calm waters and dense fog allowed the Allied forces to escape quietly, undetected, across the English Channel. As the last men were ferried to safety, the weather cleared, leaving the Germans alone on the beach and the Allies alive to fight another day. In 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed a mutual non-aggression pact. By 1941, both countries had plans to attack the other. Hitler struck first in June of 1941. Recognizing the difficulties of Russian winters, Hitler's plans were to defeat Russia before late fall. The German army was so confident it could defeat Russia quickly that several units brought dress uniforms for a victory march in Red Square, but did not bring any winter clothes. Hitler was not able to initially deploy as many troops as early in the fall as he had planned because his ally, the Italian dictator Mussolini's troops, were bogged down in Africa. So Hitler had to send his troops there to prevent Italy's defeat, thereby delaying their deployment to Russia. The result was the German troops were tired, less effective than Hitler had planned. And then heavy rains further delayed the German advance into Russia by a couple of weeks. They caused muddy conditions, and the tanks and all couldn't move. That meant that Germany was running well behind schedule. And despite all of Hitler's initial planning to defeat Russia early, he wound up in the same old trap of the Russian winter, still fighting during what turned out to be the coldest Russian winter in 140 years, leaving German soldiers unprepared for temperatures as low as 40 degrees below zero. Hitler's defeat in the Soviet Union in 1941, outside Moscow first, and then in Stalingrad the following winter, which was also exceptionally cold, was a crucial turning point in World War II. And it was largely due to the heavy rains that delayed the invasion, followed by two extraordinary cold back-to-back winters. Ultimately, that shortened the war and reduced American casualties. In early June of 1944, the Germans still controlled most of Europe. And although they knew that the Allies would attack from the sea to establish a beachhead on the continent, the Germans did not know the timing nor the location of the coming attack. The Allies had been planning this attack for more than a year and decided to launch the invasion on Normandy Beach in France on June 6th, 1944, weather permitting. And that's a whole separate part I'm not going to go into, but the weather forecast played a major role. The Allies controlled most of the Atlantic Ocean, so they had access to weather conditions there and in the UK, and the Germans did not. And weather tends to move from west to east, so that was a big advantage. Plus, since they had broken the German Enigma code used to encrypt communications, the Allies were able to access and use German weather observations on the continent. So the Allies had a big advantage for those two reasons. Knowing the German weather conditions gave the Allied meteorologists that extra information to advise General Dwight D. Eisenhower the conditions for the planned invasion would be marginal on June 6th, but acceptable. In contrast, the Germans were without Atlantic weather observations, and as I said, since weather tends to move from west to east, Uh, they forecasters said weather would be unsuitable and there would not be an invasion that day. In fact, some of the generals had gone home for a couple days at that time because they were so confident the weather was so stormy. Here again, superior knowledge of weather conditions were the key to a critical victory. For both of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in August of 1945, there were secondary targets to be used in case the weather was unfavorable over the primary target. On August 6, 1945, the cloud cover over Hiroshima was less than 3/10, clear enough to drop the first atomic weapon used in war. The lack of cloud cover sealed Hiroshima's fate and spared the backup target. On August 8th, skies were overcast over the primary target, Kokura. Instead, the bomb was released over the backup target, Nagasaki. So it was the weather that ultimately determined which Japanese would live and which ones would die. Studies have shown that poor weather conditions were positively correlated to Republican Party vote share. Poor weather conditions were positively correlated to Republican Party vote share in presidential elections in the periods from the 1950s to the early 2000s. On average, Republicans were more motivated, and so a higher percentage of Republicans voted in rain, snow, and cold than did Democrats. Most of the time, this difference did not matter, but in 1960 and again in 2000, it probably did. In the 1960 election, most of the country had relatively tranquil weather. A study showed that if rain and snow were more widespread that election day, Nixon would have won 7 more states and 105 more electoral votes. So instead of Kennedy beating Nixon 303 to 219, Nixon would have won 324 to 198. And in 2000, much of Florida experienced rainy weather on Election Day. Drier weather in Florida would likely have swung that state to Gore. So instead of Bush winning 271 to 266, Gore would have won the presidency 291 to 246. On November 22nd, 1963, the day that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, it was raining in Dallas until 10 a.m. As of that time, President Kennedy's vehicle had its bubble top on, a plexiglass cover that acted as a clear roof and protected the inhabitants from the elements. But when President Kennedy's plane touched down at the Dallas airport, the rain had just stopped and the sun came out. President Kennedy did not like a barrier between himself and the public, and so the bubble top was removed. Had the rain continued, the bubble top would have remained on during Kennedy's motorcade through Dallas, making a successful shot at him nearly impossible. And Lyndon Baines Johnson would likely have never become President of the United States. In the aftermath of the assassination, President Johnson was able to get much legislation passed, creating programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, and Head Start, as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and gave the federal government the right to intervene in states that allowed such discrimination. It's very possible that none of this legislation would have passed, at least at that time, had Kennedy remained as president. On the other hand, Kennedy was opposed to further escalation of the United States presence in Vietnam, and we can speculate that he would have most likely avoided any substantial U.S. involvement. Kennedy was more a student of history and foreign policy than Johnson, whose main expertise lie in domestic issues. Lacking confidence in foreign affairs, Johnson relied more heavily on his generals and military advisors who urged massive escalation by the United States, and as a result, more than 500,000 U.S. combat troops were deployed to Vietnam in 1967. The resulting guns and butter combination of the Johnson presidency set the nation on a path of accelerating debt and deficit spending, triggering the inflation that was part of the reason President Reagan defeated President Carter in the 1980 election. If the rain had persisted a few hours longer that Dallas morning, the United States might be a different country with less debt today. Numerous studies have shown that high temperatures can increase aggression and cause tempers and disagreements to escalate. Back in 1967, air conditioning was much less widespread than today, and most people had much less relief from summer heat and humidity. That was especially the case in cities, where the heat was exacerbated by the urban heat island effect, sometimes by as much as 4, 5, 6 degrees at nighttime. The hot weather during the summer of 1967 helped set off a spate of racially charged riots in cities across the country, including 164 incidents in Cleveland, Newark, and Detroit, where a 5-day single period resulted in 43 deaths, 7,300 arrests, and property damage of $60 million, which is equivalent to over $1 billion today. It was Sunday, February 9th, 1969, that the U.S. Weather Bureau forecast snow to quickly turn to rain in New York City. But AccuWeather's forecast called for more than a foot of snow. 15 inches of snow accumulated in the city. The city's administrator, who would oversee cleanup, was upstate and unreachable. 40% of the city's snow removal equipment was unusable. For 3 days, the city was totally paralyzed. And streets in eastern Queens still remain unplowed a full week later because the snowstorm was followed by very cold weather. Up until that point, the mayor, John Lindsay, was a popular liberal Republican mayor of New York City and had been considered a rising star in the Republican Party. And a possible successor, actually, to Richard Nixon as president. But following the storm, Lindsay lost the Republican primary and was barely reelected mayor as an independent. By 1971, he had switched to become a Democrat and left office after an unsuccessful campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination. The storm ultimately cost him his career and possibly even the presidency. Well, it wasn't the storm. It was what he did about the storm. There are many cases where there were mayors that handled storms effectively and became heroes, and many cases where they didn't and lost future elections. Over the past 300 years, there have been several tropical storms that have killed more than 100,000 people each in the India-Pakistan region, with some individual storms killing more than 250,000 people. The storm with the highest known death toll, the Great Bola Cyclone, struck East Pakistan on November 12, 1970, during an above-average lunar high tide, bringing a 20-foot-high storm surge and winds of up to 140 miles an hour with the storm surge, and all of that reaching as far as 75 miles inland. Think of that, a 20-foot storm surge across rice paddies and so on. Unbelievable. Although meteorologists did forecast the storm, there was no way at that time to communicate to most of those living in the coastal plain and the islands of the Ganges River Delta. As a result, between 250,000 and 500,000 people died. Many had been asleep when the storm surge struck, making this storm the deadliest tropical storm of all time. If that storm happened today, there are not only better forecasts, but also much better communications of warnings. For example, AccuWeather uniquely aggregates and sends to mobile devices all over the world official warnings and other advisories from the meteorological agencies of more than 70 countries. These innovative partnerships with government agencies globally provide an important communications channel directly to users, critical for alerting citizens who may be in harm's way when severe weather is on the way. However, in 1970, this capability did not exist, and the Pakistani government was severely criticized for its handling of relief operations following the disaster. That weather disaster led to the Bangladesh Liberation War, which widened into the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, concluding with the creation of the state of Bangladesh in December of 1971. On November 4th, 1979, 52 American citizens were taken hostage by a group of Iranian students following the 1979 Islamic Revolution that overthrew the Shah of Iran and replaced him as leader with the Ayatollah Khomeini. As diplomatic solutions did not yield their release, the hostages became the major news story. The show Nightline was established as a daily countdown of the hostage crisis. In April and May of 1980, President Carter launched 2 clandestine military rescue attempts, but both had to be aborted because of Iranian sandstorms known as haboobs, as sand particles suspended in the air damaged U.S. helicopters, causing one to crash. I remember at the time being aware of these haboobs and wondering whether the decision makers were taking forecasts of these storms into account and properly considering their potential effect on these missions. AccuWeather had predicted them. The rescue failures, combined with criticism of Carter's leadership as the hostages remained in captivity for over a year, are considered to be the driving force behind Ronald Reagan's defeat of President Carter in the 1980 election, leaving Carter as a one-term president. The Challenger shuttle was launched despite a record low temperature of 26 degrees at the Florida launch site on January 28, 1986. The recommendation from engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company which built the shuttle's booster rockets, was that the shuttle not be launched at temperatures below 53 degrees. It was 26. This recommendation, which had not been released to the public until much later, had been ignored, and a rubber gasket in the booster rocket failed due to the cold, allowing hot gases to hit a fuel tank, exploding the shuttle 73 seconds into our flight and killing all aboard, including the first civilian in space, the teacher, Christia McCall. A lengthy investigation was conducted, delaying the next launch for 2 years. When Hurricane Katrina hit the New Orleans area in 2005, President George W. Bush was on vacation at his ranch in Texas. In response to the damage to the storm, the president decided to cut his vacation short and fly back early to preside over the federal response. On his way back to D.C., he had Air Force One fly over parts of the devastated area, and his staff allowed news photographers to take photos of a grim-faced President Bush looking out an Air Force One window. But many Americans saw the photo as evidence that Bush was too distant from the misery below and made him seem detached and uncaring. Afterwards, President Bush's poll numbers declined and never recovered. Bush's presidential job approval rating had reached a high of 90%, almost unheard of, on September 21st, 22nd, 2001, beating his father's peak of 89% in 1991 as the highest approval rating of any president since Gallup polls began in 1945. Afterwards, Bush's popularity had leveled off in the mid-50s before dropping another 15 points in the aftermath of Katrina. In the 2008 election, although Republican nominee Senator John McCain faced other issues such as the economy and his selection of Sarah Palin as vice president nomination, the decreased popularity of Bush virtually assured that Barack Obama would beat the GOP in 2008. Albert Einstein, who many consider the smartest person to have lived in the past millennium, once remarked, one need only think of the weather, in which case the prediction, even for a few days ahead, is impossible. Now, he's a genius, but I would challenge him on that. So as visionary a genius as was Einstein, the way our technological revolution has unfolded would clearly have surprised even him. For today, we now have reasonably accurate forecasts of the weather that extend far more than a few days ahead. Mark Twain once observed that everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. Despite the rapid growth and transformation we have experienced over recent decades, humans must still contend with weather conditions over which we have no control. Humans have developed life-saving vaccines, amazing medical technology to extend life. We've gone to the moon and soon to Mars, developed vast infrastructure that connects all parts of the globe, designed agricultural methods that enable us to feed billions of people every day, and we still can't stop the snow or move a hurricane. I'm proud, though, that AccuWeather's warnings and of these types of storms has saved over 12,000 lives, and that is part of our unique legacy. Statistician and author Nate Silver, best known for his reasonably accurate forecast of U.S. elections, not so much the last couple, has studied the methodology and accuracy of many types of forecasts, looking at all types of forecasts everywhere, including politics, economics, and science. But in his 2012 essay, "The Weatherman is Not a Moron," he pointed to weather forecasting as the one area in which our predictions are making extraordinary progress. Here are a couple of things I said about a decade ago that reflect my dreams, history, and goals of AccuWeather. Do we have that next one? Okay. Today, better and improving weather forecasts and warnings, and combined with much better communication capabilities and methods, have saved many millions of lives around the world and enabled us to prepare for most weather events in advance. Even though that's the case, humans remain vulnerable to our inability to control the weather. Even minor variations, rain, snow, heat, wind, and cold, affect many of our daily activities, and the major weather events I discussed today, of course, have meaningfully altered the history of the world and the evolution of humanity. And so it will be in the future as well. It is fascinating to speculate how different the world might be today if different weather conditions had occurred during these key moments in history. Looking forward to the future, we can speculate what the next major catastrophe might be and what it might mean for humans. Could it be an asteroid, a nuclear exchange, a volcano, or nuclear tests that lead to cooling and crop failures, as has happened many times before, causing people to freeze or starve to death, or significant warming, global warming, leading to the opposite effect? And either extreme might prompt deadly viruses and other impacts, crop failures, and so on. As we've seen, there is no aspect of human life or culture or history that can escape the impact of weather and climate. And that makes my role as a meteorologist even more meaningful as humans further embrace and deal with new technologies and innovations that more accurately predict weather impacts, better communicating these weather events, and so that people can take better action to prepare themselves. I thank you for your attention today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Be happy to answer some questions.
If anyone has a question, please raise your hand.
It was a wonderful presentation, very informative. When did AccuView start?
I'm sorry?
When was AccuView started?
AccuWeather started
AccuWeather.
I started, it's all right, I started as a second-year graduate student at Penn State in 1962, 63 years ago. And I'm having just as much fun as I did then.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you sort of let us know what inputs you use to?
Can you speak up a little? I'm sorry.
Yeah, can you tell us what kind of inputs you look at to predict the weather? Like what kind of data you look at and how far in advance or you can forecast?
Absolutely. So tremendous amounts of data coming in and updating every second, really, from all over the world. This is satellite imagery, radar imagery, all kinds of weather observations, three-dimensional through the atmosphere, computer models that run 192 different computer models from the Europeans, from the National Weather Service, NOAA, from the Canadian Weather Service, Japanese Weather Service, and so on. All this comes into our global headquarters in State College, Pennsylvania, probably more weather data than any other place on the planet. And then it's all processed, and we used AI before it was called AI, and we have over 100 forecast meteorologists, and it's that combination of all that technology and AI and data constantly being updated, along with our expert meteorologists who can then interpret that and put out the most accurate forecast. But it's not only the most accurate forecast, 86 and sunny today, it's describing the weather and communicating it more effectively so people understand it and take the right action. So all forecasts are not the same. Even if more or less they're saying the same thing, we put a lot of effort into communicating it effectively so people fully understand it and take the right action. So it's a very complicated process, and it's evolved over many, many decades.
What inspired you to become a meteorologist?
That was my daughter, Victoria. I didn't plant the question. So to become a meteorologist, you need to study math, physics, and it helps to, depending on what kind of a meteorologist you want to be, if you want to be able to communicate the weather to the public or to business or whatever, it's good to have good communication skills, but basically to be good in science. And the best forecasters are really fascinated by the weather, and they develop a sixth sense by a lot of experience. By living the weather patterns, they become the best forecasters because, like any kind of prediction, there's a feel to it and know how to use all the data and information. But it's really getting a good grounding in science to start out with. And there are many good meteorological programs at colleges around the country.
Thanks
They'll
so
come
much
back.
for.
Go ahead,
thanks
I'm
so
sorry.
Thanks so much for this very, very insightful collection of facts. Just contemplating on the two quotes that you put up from Einstein and Mark
Could you speak
Twain.
up a little? I'm sorry.
Just reflect. Thank you for the very insightful talk.
You're welcome.
Just reflecting on the Einstein and Mark Twain quote. Obviously, you mentioned AI and all these methods that we can predict and bring data points together now. There's probably quite a lot that can be done in terms of predicting not just the weather, but also how it could change, kind of impact a lot of things like consumption. Do you know if there are groups or companies that's using the data of weather in a more applied way, like predicting the future based on weather and how it might, move politics or beyond? Thank you.
We serve, as was mentioned, thousands of businesses, agencies, and so on that use the. I'm sorry. I have to stay near the mic. So, there's all kinds of applications and uses by business, by government, to do better planning. It affects all these things, agriculture, construction, transportation, supply chain. So I can give you thousands of examples. Pharmaceuticals during COVID, some of the vaccines had to be shipped under certain conditions. So the supply chain, the weather's effect. We work for all the major railroads in North America because the weather affects the speed of the train, the wind. Snow can block certain places in the Rockies and such. So you're right. All businesses, if they really look at it, are impacted by weather and climate and the forecast in one way or another. And we can usually find ways to help them operate more efficiently and better. She had her hand up. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. It is really, to me, I've forgotten a lot of these incidences, and to tie this historical perspective with weather is really good. My question may be unfair. We all know that recently the weather has been very volatile. And we also know that the magnetic North Pole has moved over 100 odd miles from its true north. So I would like to understand whether you are able to give us some perspective, given the fact that, as you have just said, weather is so crucial and determined our future. So my question is, have you thought in the broader picture, what is going to happen to us going forward? And how can we best prepare ourselves for this eventual chaotic weather conditions? Thank you.
Be happy to take a stab at it. I don't know much about the magnetic North Pole because that's really not weather. But as far as we know that the climate of the Earth has gone through many, many changes. And there's been 4 great ice ages. We're now in one of those ice ages, an interglacial period. There's been 4 advances and retreats of the ice in this glacial period over the last 2 million years. We know that most of the history of the world has been warmer than it is today. But we also know that humans have thrived in a relatively cool period, and humans are now, and even though we would be warming slowly, naturally, as we come out of the ice age, because to put things in perspective, in this ice age, just 12,000 years ago, just 120 centuries ago, the ice was 2.5 miles thick over Montreal, Canada, and the southern edge of the ice sheet were the rocks in Central Park. That's how they got there. So, but we've been warming since then. At that time, 12,000 years ago, the ocean levels were 450 feet lower than they are today. So they've been rising steadily over that period of time. But over the last, it's been evident over the last 60, 70 years that humans burning of fossil fuels and putting more CO2 into the atmosphere are causing warming just due to that on top of the natural warming, and that is accelerating. In fact, the statistics, one of the things we also have is a great historical database that companies use that in order to train their algorithms and make forecasts for the future, then use our forecast to have more accurate whatever it is they're looking for. But using that database suggests that the warming is occurring faster than the climate models are predicting. You know, we've already hit the 1.5 Celsius, nearly 3 degree Fahrenheit increase from what the average was before. And I realize some of that were coming out of a very cold period, the little ice age. But even if 2/3 of that is due to humans, the fact is that we're having a significant effect. And as carbon dioxide continues to go into the atmosphere, it will continue to cause warming, and that comes from the burning of fossil fuels. But there are other effects. It reaches a point where it won't, as more CO2 is put in the atmosphere, itself won't cause linearly that same increase. But what it does is the Earth warms, it can hold more water vapor, and water vapor is a significant greenhouse gas. So warm air can hold more moisture than cold air. So there are feedback mechanisms, and as the Earth warms, there's less ice and snow. Well, snow has an albedo, or reflectivity, of 90%. Oceans have a reflectivity of only 10%. So when you replace at that extreme, where you had ice and now you have water, much more of the heat from the sun is being absorbed and now reflected back. So clearly we are in an accelerate period of warmth, and that's going to cause winners and losers, and it's going to impact crop production and a lot of things. Now, how far is that going to go? Well, we know the demand for energy, basically we all live on electricity, right? So to produce electricity, even though alternative forms of energy, windmills and particularly solar, more and more producing more, but they can't keep up with the demand. So there's going to continue to be an increase in coal and oil and gas that is burned. Every prediction shows that they're going to continue to increase. So even though all the talk about the impact, nobody wants to freeze in the winter and swelter in the summer. So we still run our air conditioning and we still drive our cars and all the rest. Even electric cars, the electricity has to come from somewhere. So, but what the true change that may save humanity is fusion, what happens on the sun. And there have been increasing breakthroughs. And if in 10, 15 years we have fusion, which will be virtually free energy in unlimited quantities, that can change everything. Without that, we're going to have to deal with major effects from warming, and some of them are going to be harmful to humanity.
We can do maybe one or two more.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was very, very interesting. I guess my question kind of relates to what you were just saying about, innovation kind of being the response to the changing climate. What is your opinion on emerging geo and climate engineering technologies? Is there merit to things like mass scale carbon capture, blasting coolants into the atmosphere, or are those inquiries kind of defunct on arrival? What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. I was in Davos, and up till this year, all the overwhelming talk was about climate change. This year, less talk about climate change and more about AI. It's just the flavor of the because there's less. We're doing a lot of things, but you still need you still need the electricity. So all these things are worthy of continued experimentation. But I think it would be a mistake to bet trillions of dollars on one, because that may be the wrong one. But certainly, we're advancing knowledge very quickly. We have AI is going to provide a lot of help in solving some of these things. It seems to me, in my guess, that fusion is the best answer for the future. Unlimited energy, very inexpensive, and no greenhouse gases at all in any way, shape, or form. And that can replace a lot of the energy sources that are now producing CO2, methane, and so on. Now, it'll take a while for that to come out of the atmosphere. The CO2 is already there. The Earth is already warmer, so you're going to have more water vapor in the air. Methane half-life is only 14 years, so that can come out a lot faster. But we have to work on our best hope is those technologies. Whether those others will, I don't think they're going to be the overall cure, but a lot of them together certainly will work to help.
We'll take one last question right here.
Hi, I love AccuWeather. Thank you for your work. My question is,
thank you.
In your slides, I noticed that all but maybe one of the sort of catastrophic weather events were sort of cold weather. Even for volcanic eruptions, the after effects that were bad were the temperature dropped. And I'm curious, it was only the one in Detroit where temperatures rose, and you talked about the aggression that can come out of that. And I'm curious just for an elaboration on why cold weather events are more devastating, and just what you think about that.
Well, it's an interesting observation. Well, when it gets particularly cold, the crops fail and people can't eat. When people can't eat, they become very angry, and if they have any energy left, they're going to try and find the food, and they're going to attack somebody, and so on and so forth. So we know when it gets colder, particularly of significance, crops fail, starvation. We tend to get viruses spreading, bugs killing people. We've had many that have devastated a quarter or more of the Earth's population. We were lucky. Even the Spanish flu, 1917, only about 1% of the population was wiped out. In this past one, COVID, where we went crazy over, it was only 1/4 of 1%. We're talking about times in the past where there was 20, 25%, maybe more. So put that in perspective. So this is what's happened with the cold. So we have many examples of that. But I talked about I talked about the Dust Bowl of the 1930s and so on. But yeah.
That's all the time we have for questions, unfortunately. Thank you all for coming. Please give one more round of applause for Dr. Joel Myers. Books for sale right outside the door here, and hope to see you next Monday.